What see you there, that hath so cowered and chased your blood out of appearance? Henry V. We are under the necessity of returning to Edinburgh, where the General Assembly was now sitting. It is well known that some Scottish nobleman is usually deputed as High Commissioner, to represent the person of the King in this convocation, that he has allowances for the purpose of maintaining a certain outward show and solemnity, and supporting the hospitality of the representative of Majesty. Whoever are distinguished by rank or office, in or near the capital, usually attend the morning levees of the Lord Commissioner, and walk with him in procession to the place where the assembly meets. The nobleman who held this office chanced to be particularly connected with Sir George Staunton, and it was in his train that he ventured to tread the High Street of Edinburgh for the first time since the fatal night of Porteous's execution. Walking at the right hand of the representative of sovereignty, covered with lace and embroidery, and with all the paraphernalia of wealth and rank, the handsome though wasted figure of the English stranger attracted all eyes. Who could have recognized in a form so aristocratic the plebeian convict, that, disguised in the rags of Madge Wildfire, had led the formidable rioters to their destined revenge? There was no possibility that this could happen, even if any of his ancient acquaintances, a race of men whose lives are so brief, had happened to survive the span commonly allotted to evildoers. Besides, the whole affair had long fallen asleep, with the angry passions in which it originated. Nothing is more certain than that persons known to have had a share in that formidable riot, and to have fled from Scotland on that account, had made money abroad, returned to enjoy it in their native country, and lived and died undisturbed by the law. See Arnett's Criminal Trials, 4th edition, page 235. The forbearance of the magistrate was, in these instances, wise, certainly, and just, for what good impression could be made on the public mind by punishment, when the memory of the offense was obliterated, and all that was remembered was the recent inoffensive, or perhaps exemplary conduct of the offender? Sir George Staunton might, therefore, tread the scene of his former audacious exploits, free from the apprehension of the law, or even of discovery or suspicion. But with what feelings his heart that day throbbed, must be left to those of the reader to imagine. It was an object of no common interest which had brought him to encounter so many painful remembrances. In consequence of Jeanie's letter to Lady Staunton, transmitting the confession, he had visited the town of Carlisle, and had found Archdeacon Fleming still alive, by whom that confession had been received. This reverend gentleman, whose character stood deservedly very high, he so far admitted into his confidence, as to own himself the father of the unfortunate infant which had been spirited away by Madge Wildfire, representing the intrigue as a matter of juvenile extravagance on his own part, for which he was now anxious to atone, by tracing, if possible, what had become of the child. After some recollection of the circumstances, the clergyman was able to call to memory that the unhappy woman had written a letter to George Staunton, Esq., Younger, Rectory, Willingham, by Grantham, that he had forwarded it to the address accordingly, and that it had been returned, with a note from the Reverend Mr. Staunton, Rector of Willingham, saying, he knew no such person as him to whom the letter was addressed. As this had happened just at the time when George had, for the last time, absconded from his father's house to carry off Effie, he was at no loss to account for the cause of the resentment, under the influence of which his father had disowned him. This was another instance in which his ungovernable temper had occasioned his misfortune. Had he remained at Willingham but a few days longer, he would have received Margaret Murdockson's letter, in which were exactly described the person and haunts of the woman, Annapole Bailsou, to whom she had parted with the infant. It appeared that Meg Murdockson had been induced to make this confession, less from any feelings of contrition than from the desire of obtaining, through George Staunton or his father's means, protection and support for her daughter Madge. Her letter to George Staunton said that while the writer lived, her daughter would have needed naught from anybody, and that she would never have meddled in these affairs, except to pay back the ill that George had done to her and hers. But she was to die, and her daughter would be destitute, and without reason to guide her. She had lived in the world long enough to know that people did nothing for nothing, so she had told George Staunton all he could wish to know about his wean, in hopes he would not see the demented young creature he had ruined perish for want. As for her motives for not telling them sooner, she had a long account to reckon for in the next world, and she would reckon for that too. The clergyman said that Meg had died in the same desperate state of mind, occasionally expressing some regret about the child which was lost, but oftener sorrow that the mother had not been hanged, her mind at once a chaos of guilt, rage, and apprehension for her daughter's future safety, that instinctive feeling of parental anxiety which she had in common with the she-wolf and lioness, being the last shade of kindly affection that occupied a breast equally savage. The melancholy catastrophe of Madge Wildfire was occasioned by her taking the confusion of her mother's execution, as affording an opportunity of leaving the workhouse to which the clergyman had sent her, and presenting herself to the mob in their fury, to perish in the way we have already seen. When Dr. Fleming found the convict's letter was returned from Lincolnshire, he wrote to a friend in Edinburgh, to inquire into the fate of the unfortunate girl whose child had been stolen, and was informed by his correspondent that she had been pardoned, and that, with all her family, she had retired to some distant part of Scotland, or left the kingdom entirely. And here the matter rested, until, at Sir George Staunton's application, the clergyman looked out, and produced Margaret Murdochson's returned letter, and the other memoranda which he had kept concerning the affair. Whatever might be Sir George Staunton's feelings in ripping up this miserable history, and listening to the tragical fate of the unhappy girl whom he had ruined, he had so much of his ancient wilfulness of disposition left, as to shut his eyes on everything, save the prospect which seemed to open itself of recovering his son. It was true, it would be difficult to produce him, without telling much more of the history of his birth, and the misfortunes of his parents, than it was prudent to make known. But let him once be found, and, being found, let him but prove worthy of his father's protection, and many ways might be fallen upon to avoid such risk. Sir George Staunton was at liberty to adopt him as his heir, if he pleased, without communicating the secret of his birth, or an Act of Parliament might be obtained, declaring him legitimate, and allowing him the name and arms of his father. He was indeed already a legitimate child according to the law of Scotland, by the subsequent marriage of his parents. Wilful in everything, Sir George's sole desire now was to see this son, even should his recovery bring with it a new series of misfortunes, as dreadful as those which followed on his being lost. But where was the youth who might eventually be called to the honors and estates of this ancient family? On what heath was he wandering, and shrouded by what mean disguise? Did he gain his precarious bread by some petty trade, by menial toil, by violence, or by theft? These were questions on which Sir George's anxious investigations could obtain no light. Many remembered that Annapol Bailza wandered through the country as a beggar and fortune-teller, or spaewife. Some remembered that she had been seen with an infant in 1737 or 1738, but for more than 10 years she had not travelled that district, and that she had been heard to say she was going to a distant part of Scotland, of which country she was a native. To Scotland, therefore, came Sir George Staunton, having parted with his lady at Glasgow, and his arrival at Edinburgh happening to coincide with the sitting of the General Assembly of the Kirk. His acquaintance with the nobleman who held the office of Lord High Commissioner forced him more into public than suited either his views or inclinations. At the public table of this nobleman, Sir George Staunton was placed next to a clergyman of respectable appearance, and well-bred, though plain demeanour, whose name he discovered to be Butler. It had been no part of Sir George's plan to take his brother-in-law into his confidence, and he had rejoiced exceedingly in the assurances he received from his wife, that Mrs. Butler, the very soul of integrity and honour, had never suffered the account he had given of himself at Willingham Rectory to transpire, even to her husband. But he was not sorry to have an opportunity to converse with so near a connection without being known to him, and to form a judgment of his character and understanding. He saw much, and heard more, to raise Butler very high in his opinion. He found he was generally respected by those of his own profession, as well as by the laity who had seats in the assembly. He had made several public appearances in the assembly, distinguished by good sense, candour, and ability, and he was followed and admired as a sound, and, at the same time, an eloquent preacher. This was all very satisfactory to Sir George Staunton's pride, which had revolted at the idea of his wife's sister being obscurely married. He now began, on the contrary, to think the connection so much better than he expected, that, if it should be necessary to acknowledge it, in consequence of the recovery of his son, it would sound well enough that Lady Staunton had a sister, who, in the decayed state of the family, had married a Scottish clergyman, high in the opinion of his countrymen, and a leader in the church. It was with these feelings, that, when the Lord High Commissioner's company broke up, Sir George Staunton, under pretence of prolonging some inquiries concerning the constitution of the Church of Scotland, requested Butler to go home to his lodgings in the Lawnmarket, and drink a cup of coffee. Butler agreed to wait upon him, providing Sir George would permit him, in passing, to call at a friend's house where he resided, and make his apology for not coming to partake her tea. They proceeded up the High Street, entered the Crams, and passed the begging box, placed to remind those at liberty of the distresses of the poor prisoners. Sir George paused there one instant, and next day a L20 note was found in that receptacle for public charity. When he came up to Butler again, he found him with his eyes fixed on the entrance of the Tolbooth, and apparently in deep thought. "That seems a very strong door," said Sir George, by way of saying something. "It is so, sir," said Butler, turning off and beginning to walk forward, "but it was my misfortune at one time to see it prove greatly too weak." At this moment, looking at his companion, he asked him whether he felt himself ill? And Sir George Staunton admitted that he had been so foolish as to eat ice, which sometimes disagreed with him. With kind officiousness, that would not be gainsaid, and ere he could find out where he was going, Butler hurried Sir George into the friend's house, near to the prison, in which he himself had lived since he came to town, being, indeed, no other than that of our old friend Bartoline Saddletree, in which Lady Staunton had served a short novitiate as a shopmaid. This recollection rushed on her husband's mind, and the blush of shame which it excited overpowered the sensation of fear which had produced his former paleness. Good Mrs. Saddletree, however, bustled about to receive the rich English baronet as the friend of Mr. Butler, and requested an elderly female in a black gown to sit still, in a way which seemed to imply a wish that she would clear the way for her betters. In the meanwhile, understanding the state of the case, she ran to get some cordial waters, sovereign, of course, in all cases of faintishness whatsoever. During her absence, her visitor, the female in black, made some progress out of the room, and might have left it altogether without particular observation, had she not stumbled at the threshold, so near Sir George Staunton that he, in point of civility, raised her and assisted her to the door. "Mrs. Porteous has turned very doit now, poor body," said Mrs. Saddletree, as she returned with her bottle in her hand. "She is no as auld, but she got a sair back cast why the slaughter o' her husband. Ye had some trouble about that job, Mr. Butlard. I think, sir," to Sir George, "ye had better drink out the hale glass, for to my een ye look waur than when ye came in." And, indeed, he grew as pale as a corpse, on recollecting who it was that his arm had so lately supported, the widow whom he had so large a share in making such. "It is a prescribed job that case of Porteous now," said old Saddletree, who was confined to his chair by the gout, "clean prescribed and out of date." "I am not clear of that, neighbour," said Plumdamas, "for I have heard them say 20 years should rin, and this is but the 50 Porteous's mob was in 37. "Ye'll no teach me law, I think, neighbour, me that has foregone please, and might hae had 14, and it hadna been the good wife? I tell ye, if the foremost of the Porteous mob were standing there where that gentleman stands, the king's advocate wadna meddle why him it effes under the negative prescription." "Haud your din, Carles," said Mrs. Saddletree, "and let the gentleman sit down and get a dish of comfortable tea." But Sir George had had quite enough of their conversation, and Butler, at his request, made an apology to Mrs. Saddletree, and accompanied him to his lodgings. Here they found another guest waiting Sir George Staunton's return. This was no other than our reader's old acquaintance, Ratcliffe. This man had exercised the office of turnkey with so much vigilance, acuteness, and fidelity, that he gradually rose to be governor, or captain of the Tolbooth. And it is yet to be remembered in tradition, that young men, who rather sought amusing than select society in their merry meetings, used sometimes to request Ratcliffe's company, in order that he might regale them with legends of his extraordinary feats in the way of robbery and escape. There seems an anachronism in the history of this person. Ratcliffe, among other escapes from justice, was released by the Porteous mob when under sentence of death, and he was again under the same predicament when the Highlanders made a similar jail delivery in 1745. He was too sincere a Whig to embrace liberation at the hands of the Jacobites, and in reward was made one of the keepers of the Tolbooth. So at least runs constant tradition. But he lived and died without resuming his original vocation, otherwise than in his narratives over a bottle. Under these circumstances, he had been recommended to Sir George Staunton by a man of the law in Edinburgh, as a person likely to answer any questions he might have to ask about Annibal Bailzou, who, according to the colour which Sir George Staunton gave to his cause of inquiry, was supposed to have stolen a child in the west of England, belonging to a family in which he was interested. The gentleman had not mentioned his name, but only his official title, so that Sir George Staunton, when told that the captain of the Tolbooth was waiting for him in his parlour, had no idea of meeting his former acquaintance, Jem Ratcliffe. This, therefore, was another new and most unpleasant surprise, for he had no difficulty in recollecting this man's remarkable features. The change, however, from George Robertson to Sir George Staunton, baffled even the penetration of Ratcliffe, and he bowed very low to the baronet and his guest, hoping Mr. Butler would excuse his recollecting that he was an old acquaintance. "And once rendered my wife a piece of great service," said Mr. Butler, "for which she sent you a token of grateful acknowledgment, which I hope came safe and was welcome." "Deil a doubt on't," said Ratcliffe, with a knowing nod, "but ye are muckle changed for the better since I saw ye, Maister Butler. So much so, that I wonder you knew me." "Ah, then, deil a face I see I ever forget," said Ratcliffe, while Sir George Staunton, tied to the stake, and incapable of escaping, internally cursed the accuracy of his memory. "And yet, sometimes," continued Ratcliffe, "the sharpest hand will be ta'en in. There is a face in this very room, if I might presume to be a sae bald, that, if I didna ken the honourable person it belangs to, I might think it had some cut of an auld acquaintance." "I should not be much flattered," answered the baronet, sternly, and roused by the risk in which he saw himself placed, "if it is to me you mean to apply that compliment." "By no manner of means, sir," said Ratcliffe, bowing very low. "I am come to receive your honour's commands, and no to trouble your honour why my poor observations." "Well, sir," said Sir George, "I am told you understand police matters, so do I. To convince you of which, here are 10 guineas of retaining fee. I make them 50 when you can find me certain notice of a person, living or dead, whom you will find described in that paper. I shall leave town presently. You may send your written answer to me to the care of Mr. naming his highly respectable agent, or of His Grace the Lord High Commissioner." Ratcliffe bowed and withdrew. "I have angered the proud Pete now," he said to himself, "by finding out a likeness, but if George Robertson's father had lived within a mile of his mother, d—n me if I should not know what to think, for as high as he carries his head." When he was left alone with Butler, Sir George Staunton ordered tea and coffee, which were brought by his valet, and then, after considering with himself for a minute, asked his guest whether he had lately heard from his wife and family. Butler, with some surprise at the question, replied that he had received no letter for some time. His wife was a poor penwoman. "Then," said Sir George Staunton, "I am the first to inform you there has been an invasion of your quiet premises since you left home. My wife, whom the Duke of Argyll had the goodness to permit to use Roseneth Lodge, while she was spending some weeks in your country, has sallied across and taken up her quarters in the manse, as she says, to be nearer the goats, whose milk she is using, but, I believe, in reality, because she prefers Mrs. Butler's company to that of the respectable gentleman who acts as seneschal on the Duke's domains." Mr. Butler said, he had often heard the late Duke and the present speak with high respect of Lady Staunton, and was happy if his house could accommodate any friend of theirs. It would be but a very slight acknowledgment of the many favours he owed them. "That does not make Lady Staunton and myself the less obliged to your hospitality, sir," said Sir George. "May I inquire if you think of returning home soon?" "In the course of 2 days, Mr. Butler answered. His duty in the assembly would be ended, and the other matters he had in town being all finished, he was desirous of returning to Dumbartonshire as soon as he could, but he was under the necessity of transporting a considerable sum in bills and money with him, and therefore wished to travel in company with one or two of his brethren of the clergy. "My escort will be more safe," said Sir George Staunton, "and I think of setting off tomorrow or next day. If you will give me the pleasure of your company, I will undertake to deliver you in your charge safe at the manse, provided you will admit me along with you." Mr. Butler gratefully accepted of this proposal. The appointment was made accordingly, and, by dispatches with one of Sir George's servants, who was sent forward for the purpose, the inhabitants of the manse of Knocktarlody were made acquainted with the intended journey, and the news rung through the whole vicinity, that the minister was coming back wi' a braw English gentleman and the siller that was to pay for the estate of Craigshire. This sudden resolution of going to Knocktarlody had been adopted by Sir George Staunton in consequence of the incidents of the evening. In spite of his present consequence, he felt he had presumed too far in venturing so near the scene of his former audacious acts of violence, and he knew too well, from past experience, the acuteness of a man like Ratcliffe, again to encounter him. The next 2 days he kept his lodgings, under pretence of indisposition, and took leave by writing of his noble friend the High Commissioner, alleging the opportunity of Mr. Butler's company as a reason for leaving Edinburgh sooner than he had proposed. He had a long conference with his agent on the subject of Annapole Bailzou, and the professional gentleman, who was the agent also of the Argyle family, had directions to collect all the information which Ratcliffe or others might be able to obtain concerning the fate of that woman and the unfortunate child, and so soon as anything transpired which had the least appearance of being important, that he should send an express with it instantly to Knocktarlody. These instructions were backed with a deposit of money, and a request that no expense might be spared, so that Sir George Staunton had little reason to apprehend negligence on the part of the persons entrusted with the commission. The journey, which the brothers made in company, was attended with more pleasure, even to Sir George Staunton, than he had ventured to expect. His heart lightened in spite of himself when they lost sight of Edinburgh, and the easy, sensible conversation of Butler was well calculated to withdraw his thoughts from painful reflections. He even began to think whether there could be much difficulty in removing his wife's connections to the rectory of Willingham. It was only on his part procuring some still better preferment for the present incumbent, and on Butler's, that he should take orders according to the English Church, to which he could not conceive a possibility of his making objection, and then he had them residing under his wing. No doubt there was pain in seeing Mrs. Butler, acquainted, as he knew her to be, with the full truth of his evil history, but then her silence, though he had no reason to complain of her indiscretion hitherto, was still more absolutely ensured. It would keep his lady, also, both in good temper and in more subjection, for she was sometimes troublesome to him by insisting on remaining in town when he desired to retire to the country, alleging the total want of society at Willingham. "Madam, your sister is there," would, he thought, be a sufficient answer to this ready argument. He sounded Butler on this subject, asking what he would think of an English living of £1,200 yearly, with the burden of affording his company now and then to a neighbour, whose health was not strong or his spirits equal. He might meet, he said, occasionally, a very learned and accomplished gentleman, who was in orders as a Catholic priest, but he hoped that would be no insurmountable objection to a man of his liberality of sentiment. What, he said, would Mr. Butler think of as an answer, if the offer should be made to him? "Simply that I could not accept of it," said Mr. Butler. "I have no mind to enter into the various debates between the churches, but I was brought up in mine own, have received her ordination, am satisfied of the truth of her doctrines, and will die under the banner I have enlisted to." "What may be the value of your preferment," said Sir George Staunton, "unless I am asking an indiscreet question?" "Probably 100 a year, 1 year with another, besides my glebe and pasture ground." "And you scruple to exchange that for 1200 a year, without alleging any damning difference of doctrine betwixt the two churches of England and Scotland?" "On that, sir, I have reserved my judgment. There may be much good, and there are certainly saving means in both, but every man must act according to his own lights." I hope I have done, and am in the course of doing, my master's work in this Highland parish, and it would ill become me, for the sake of lucre, to leave my sheep in the wilderness. But, even in the temporal view which you have taken of the matter, Sir George, this £100 a year of stipend hath fed and clothed us, and left us nothing to wish for. My father-in-law's succession, and other circumstances, have added a small estate of about twice as much more, and how we are to dispose of it I do not know, so I leave it to you, sir, to think if I were wise, not having the wish or opportunity of spending 300 a year, to covet the possession of 4 times that sum. This is philosophy, said Sir George. I have heard of it, but I never saw it before. It is common sense, replied Butler, which accords with philosophy and religion more frequently than pedants or zealots are apt to admit. Sir George turned the subject, and did not again resume it. Although they travelled in Sir George's chariot, he seemed so much fatigued with the motion, that it was necessary for him to remain for a day at a small town called Mid-Calder, which was their first stage from Edinburgh. Glasgow occupied another day, so slow were their motions. They travelled on to Dumbarton, where they had resolved to leave the equipage and to hire a boat to take them to the shores near the manse, as the Gairloch lay betwixt them and that point, besides the impossibility of travelling in that district with wheel carriages. Sir George's valet, a man of trust, accompanied them, as also a footman. The grooms were left with the carriage. Just as this arrangement was completed, which was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, an express arrived from Sir George's agent in Edinburgh, with a packet, which he opened and read with great attention, appearing much interested and agitated by the contents. The packet had been dispatched very soon after their leaving Edinburgh, but the messenger had missed the travellers by passing through Mid-Calder in the night, and overshot his errand by getting to Roseneth before them. He was now on his return, after having waited more than 24 hours. Sir George Staunton instantly wrote back an answer, and rewarding the messenger liberally, desired him not to sleep till he placed it in his agent's hands.